Hello, and welcome to the Hour of History podcast. This is your host, Stephen Bauman, and this week my guest is the author and prolific writer, Mike J. He's just written the fabulous book, Mescaline, A Global History of the First Psychedelic. Our conversation ranges, much like his book, from 2000 BC to the present day, from the Andes in South America to New York City and London. It's a fascinating look at a very interesting topic and a drug that many people have heard of, but maybe don't know the history. I hope you enjoy the show, and I hope you go to hourofhistory.com to find more great content and recommendations. On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. Enjoy.
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast, Our World.
Anytime, any place.
For show notes, links, and more, be sure to visit our website at www.hourofhistory.com. And for all the book recommendations made during the podcast, head over to hourofhistory.com/rex. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. Without further delay, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hi, and welcome to the Hour of History podcast. Mike J., how are you doing?
Very good. How are you, Stephen?
I'm doing very well, and I'm really excited to have you on. You've just written a new book, and it seems to have captured the interest of quite a few people. Can you tell us first about yourself, a little background before we get into the text?
Yeah, I'm a writer and a curator and a historian. I've written quite a lot of books. My normal beat is kind of a history of science and medicine. I've done quite a lot in that area. And I guess my specialism within that is the history of kind of psychoactive drugs and also madness and psychiatry and mental health. So I've written quite a lot around, I'm particularly interested in looking at the stories of psychoactive drugs through history and across different cultures around the world. I think it just opens up a load of fascinating stories. And this is one that's always been one of the most fascinating for me, which is the story of mescaline. And so my new book is just called Mescaline, A Global History of the First Psychedelic.
And already, I mean, it's such a compelling title and such an interesting topic. First, we have, mescaline, a drug name right there for you, but also this tagline, A Global History, which is very in vogue. We see it in a lot of books, and then of the first psychedelic. Why mescaline? I know you've written other books, like you said, you're interested in these kind of drugs, but why mescaline particularly?
What interests me about the story of mescaline is that, I guess most people's first cultural reference for this is Aldous Huxley and The Doors of Perception, which was his description of his first mescaline trip in 1954. And it was after that the word psychedelic was coined. So the whole idea of kind of psychedelics and psychedelic culture, comes out of, Aldous Huxley's mescaline trip. But that's, in terms of mescaline, that's not the beginning of mescaline's story. In fact, it's pretty much the end of mescaline's story. By that time, mescaline is kind of being overtaken by other psychedelics. But mescaline has this extraordinary storied history that goes way, way back, long. So it's a chance to look at, all these things that we now put in the sort of pigeonhole of psychedelic. And it's a chance to look at all these, things, without that cultural construct around them. So we find that mescaline was used widely as a drug, as a research chemical, through the first half of the 20th century, that it was being taken by scientists and artists and doctors and aesthetes and spiritual figures. And, before that, then there's an amazing story of how it arrived in the West, which is basically through one of its natural sources, the Peyote cactus. So mescaline in nature exists in a couple of families of cacti. So the stories of those cacti, the peyote, and in the Andean South America, the San Pedro, go way, way back into prehistory. So mescaline exists in two forms, one form of which is a cactus, and the other form of which is like a white powder that you can synthesize in a lab. And it also has, in a way, kind of two histories. It has a long indigenous non-Western history, and then it has a kind of history that's, almost the kind of parallel history of the 20th century in Western modernity.
And so that's kind of a fascinating place to start, because as a global historian, you always have to decide, well, where does history begin? And you've decided to start way back in time. Is that something that mescaline is particular to? Is that something that makes it special?
There are quite a lot of psychoactive plants whose use is testified to one way or another in prehistory. Psychoactive plants don't survive very well in the prehistoric record. Oftentimes, they're not. There's no physical survival of them, and of course, one of the things that you can't know from archaeology is, how plants were used. What was the ritual or ceremonial or healing context around them. But I guess we can follow both the mescaline-containing cacti back through art and archaeology, at least 3,000 or 4,000 years. And I guess you could follow a plant like opium or the coca leaf or tobacco. Also, they go back that far.
But mescaline has this psychoactive property that, say, tobacco doesn't. Before we go any further, can you sort of explain the definitions and parameters? What makes something psychoactive?
Right. Well, tobacco is psychoactive, and a lot of I guess psychoactive is anything that changes the way that we feel, or the way that we think, or the way that we perceive the world. So tobacco kind of does that for its contemporary users in the West, but it certainly does that very potently for people in kind of in Amazon sort of cultures who will kind of eat it or drink decoctions of it, take enormous kind of doses of it, and pass out and have visions. So psychedelic is, as we said, it's a modern term. It's a modern construct in many ways. It's based on modern notions of the mind. If we just and I think psychoactivity is also quite hard to define. In some cultures, foods are definitely psychoactive. Chilies, for example. In the cultures that we're talking about, people conceive them in different ways. But I think a modern pharmacist would say that psychoactive plants or psychoactive drugs include everything from the caffeine in tea and coffee, through nicotine, through to things like coca leaf that people chew, and then more powerful things like hallucinogenic mushrooms or like mescaline.
But we have such sort of established perceptions in the West of kind of this drug and the different classes and different schedules. Does a global history, and one that goes back so far, kind of explain that and untangle it a little bit?
It certainly does. I think as soon as you start looking at, in the West at the moment, we have a very, I think it's becoming slightly less clear, but we have more or less a clear line between, psychoactive drugs that we don't even think of as psychoactive drugs. We'd never call, a cup of tea or a glass of Chardonnay a drug, even though they're psychoactive. It's a word we kind of reserve for things that are illicit or not socially approved, like cocaine or ecstasy or whatever. But as soon as we move back in time through history, you've got to go back, as only a century in America, and you find that, alcohol was a prohibited drug, as it is in many parts of the world today. And around that same time, you could have gone into your local pharmacy and found heroin or cocaine on the shelf.
And it is kind of fascinating to think about that and how that changes as it interacts with culture. And one of the things that you sort of start out with, and something that you start out with and end with, and end your book and talk about frequently, is this ritual. how do ritual and drugs interact?
That's a really great question. It was I think psychoactive drugs always tend to kind of bring rituals around them. I mean, even if we think of our morning cup of coffee, how ritualized is that?
Mm-hmm.
And we think of the way that we consume alcohol. We kind of, if you're drinking with somebody in a bar, you'll clink your beer and you'll say cheers or whatever you say. That's the kind of, I think, a vestigial sort of ritual. That's an acknowledgement that we're drinking together. Drinking together has a very different cultural meaning from solitary drinking. So I think even in our very secularized culture today, there's a lot of ritual around psychoactive drugs, and I think you see that when it's interesting to go back to the arrival of the Spanish in Mexico, which was the first encounter of the West with a lot of these strange drugs. And some of them turned out to be quite easily co-opted by the West, things like tobacco and cocoa or chocolate. They became very, very valuable commodities, and they were used in rather different ways. In Europe, they had to be kind of, the rituals and the preparations and the accessories all had to be customized for Western tastes. But there were other things like the peyote cactus or the hallucinogenic mushroom that were just kind of too strange, too striking in their effects to incorporate in that way. And if you look at what the first Spanish commentators thought of these, they associated them with drunkenness. Their kind of cultural analogy for this is like getting, very, very very, very drunk on very, very strong alcohol. And they found that Indians took to their alcohol as well, and they kind of saw these things as a kind of drunkenness. What they didn't see was how that these drugs had a very different role in traditional Native American cultures. There wasn't such a thing as kind of the sort of modest drinking that Europeans did. There certainly wasn't such a thing as solitary drinking. It was a thing that you did with people together, and you did to excess, and you did it occasionally. And so these things that were in Native American context, rituals and ceremonies, just looked to Americanize like kind of drunken orgies.
And how much of that do you think was like you describe, this is chaos that's happening, and how much of it do you think is like, this is a chaos that we don't really know how to access or control, so we're going to kind of ban it? Like, do you think the Spanish were intimidated, or did they try to join in?
They were, if you look at the early commentators, people like Sahagun, who wrote about this in detail, you can see a couple of, there are a couple of warring tendencies. On one hand, he kind of compares himself to a classical natural historian, someone like Pliny. He's trying to write a learned and accurate and informed kind of testimony to this new world and its lands and its cultures. On the other hand, he's also writing for an audience largely composed of missionaries, a lot of them Jesuits, who are looking for spiritual guidance on this. It was very, very confusing to the Spanish when they arrived to see just how similar Native American ceremonies around these plants looked to the Spanish ceremonies, to the Mass and to the Communion. They found, people burning copal incense just as they would burn frankincense in church, and a priest figure going around with these mushrooms or little cactus buttons, giving them to people who take them with their eyes downcast, mumbling a prayer. What are we to do about this thing that so obviously looks like our own sacrament? So is this because the Indians are all devils, or is it because the devil himself is manipulating them and kind of making fun of them with this parody of the sacrament? So, there was a lot of debate at the time about, trying to get this right. And I think what you ended up with was the idea that this wasn't the fault of the Indians. They didn't know better. They were kind of childlike, and they were being deceived by the devil. The devil was really in these substances, in the mushrooms or the cactus, and so they needed to be prohibited. And so in 1620, the very first prohibition of a drug, in Western culture was the prohibition of the peyote cactus by the Mexican Inquisition.
It's interesting to hear about these like cross-cultural interactions with mind-altering things, because we can't really understand what's happening in someone else's mind unless we're listening to their words that they describe. But that's kind of, even if you read Huxley, we're kind of, Huxley's really good with words, and we still have to take him at his word that this is kind of what he saw. So
we do, and William James, who took peyote in the 1890s, said that one of the classic sort of defining features of these kinds of experiences that they're ineffable. So ineffability is still used as a kind of sort of rather very precise sort of clinical code for judging whether a mystical experience has been had or not. And ineffability is still one of the tick boxes.
Interesting. And so as you're going all over the globe, you're starting in South America and Mexico, and you're in what is now the United States. You have to find a way of piecing together, in what is a lot of ways like a mental history that you're doing. You're tracing people's experiences kind of from their word. So you use a lot of different approaches. You have botany in there. You're reading people's own accounts. Can you talk a little bit about the source bases and how you piece together perspectives of people not only from different parts of the world but from very different times?
Yeah, this is a real fundamental difference I found between, as I mentioned earlier, the kind of the two histories of mescaline, the Western and the non-Western. The Western history, I mean, right from the very beginning, the first Westerners to take peyote in the 1890s write about it. They're scientists, they're neurologists, or they're physicians, or they're psychologists, and the first thing they do is to describe in great detail. I mean, what's great about those accounts is that at that time, scientists were often had a very good background in the humanities. So they were often writers, they were novelists, they were poets, as well as being doctors. And at that time, before, the sort of modern world of tick box diagnoses and DSM and stuff, you had to be very good at description. So you get these very full descriptions, and that sets a tone that really runs through the Western history, which is that you get all these subjective first-person accounts, and they also tend to concentrate on the visual aspects. They're characteristically, 8:52 p.m. I'm sitting in my study. I've just drunk this decoction of peyote buttons, and I'm starting to see kind of, violet and green lights around my pen as it hovers over the notepad. And that's kind of, so we've got a very, very rich Western history in terms of first-person accounts. What's curious when you go back and then look at the sort of non-Western indigenous history is how few there are. There are basically no first-person accounts. There are some that have been elicited by anthropologists. But by and large, I think that's because that's not the way that the experience is conceived. And in indigenous cultures, it's seen as kind of very crude and reductive to, extract the psychoactive component from everything else. You're not saying the peyote made me feel like this. You're certainly not saying the mescaline in the peyote made me feel like this. The peyote is a presiding spirit over an experience which is communal, and which has all sorts of other components, ritual and ceremonial. And quite often in a lot of these traditions, Mexican and Native American, it's regarded as, if you spend too much time getting hung up on these sort of visual patterns or the sort of fireworks that you're seeing, that's regarded as kind of a distraction. That's missing the point. There's a big, important kind of communal thing going on. And if you're just focusing on these pretty patterns on the inside of your eyelids, then, you need to kind of open your eyes and see what's going on. So there are very, very different, composing those two histories is very, very different because you're working with such completely different types of source material. So you end up with a a Western history that's much more about individuals and their experience, and then a non-Western history that's much more kind of embodied within the wider culture.
I'm curious if we could, take a little bit to go into each of these and this sort of idea about collective versus individual. Maybe we can start with and talking about interpretation as well, and maybe we can start with sort of the non-Western or the non, I guess, and even that is kind of a strange thing, right? Because it is Western Hemisphere history.
Yes.
But this idea of a spiritual seeking and a communal experience, how did these interpretations go rather than direct observation? What were people learning from mescaline?
I think from early on, you can see from Western descriptions that there are two types of ceremony with these cacti, and one is a kind of a sort of one-on-one, with a shaman or a healer or or whatever you want to call them, and somebody who comes to them, and both in the sort of Andean traditions with the San Pedro cactus and in the Mexican traditions with the peyote, you can see that this is something that looks a little like our idea of a one-on-one therapy session. And it can be about physical healing, or it can be about asking questions, more divination, how is my cousin doing who's kind of a long way away, where did this, misfortune that's hit us come from? So it's kind of like a kind of clairvoyance. So there's that. And then there's also, what you see very clearly in the Mexican tradition, this larger communal experience where an entire community will take the cactus and usually dance around a fire all night. And I think you can start to see in the Native American church ceremony, which is a very, very beautiful ceremony, very, very rich in symbols and metaphors, with everybody sitting around a fire with an altar with the moon outside and, singing and prayers and, little ritual moments all through the night. You can kind of see that this is working. All these symbols and metaphors are clustering around a couple of ideas. One is about kind of, the course of the life. So, you're sitting there and you're being prompted in all kinds of ways to think of, to have a little bit of a bird's eye view on your life and think, where am I in my life? Where am I going? Things like the course of the moon tracking across the sky through a night, the phases of the moon. There's a lot of, so I think there's a lot about these rituals that aids that kind of introspection. And I think there's also, maybe particularly in the Native American church, there's a whole cluster of imagery, about the possibility that you can change the course of your life, either physically through a healing intervention or mentally or in terms of your relationship with the people around you. So I think that's really where the meaning of the mescaline containing cacti is embodied in these big social ceremonies, which give people a chance to look at themselves and also a chance to resituate themselves within their social world.
It's really interesting to hear about this introspection and how it's kind of like the human or the human experience, at least in the case that you've just described, seems much smaller. And hopefully later in the conversation, we can get back to talking about the Native American church and what that is and that sort of thing. But before we do that, I'm curious now if we could compare this to sort of the European scientific approach to this, where it seems that it's almost the reverse in some ways, where rather than the person just being a speck who is just kind of charting their journey or looking for a change, it's the person is the focus, and what is happening inside the person, to my understanding. How much of it is that? And then how much of it did you find are sort of expectations? Here are these scientists who know that they're about to ingest something that's supposed to do something for them. How did you ever find that people were kind of playing into it and selling it?
Oh yeah, that's another reason why I think mescaline is such an interesting subject because, as I say in the subtitle, it's the first psychedelic. So the majority of people who are taking it, from the 1890s through to the 1950s, it's the first experience they've had, of like this. They don't have a set of expectations, and there's an enormous diversity in the responses that you get, which I think is partly due to mescaline's curious effects, which is on the one hand, as we said, a lot of very beautiful visual hallucinations, very magical, enchanted kind of experience. But also at the same time, physically, it's kind of something of an ordeal. It's pretty rough. You can get a lot of nausea. So you have these kind of, it's almost like you're having just a wonderful sort of magical experience while being really sick at the same time, And some people, William James is a good early example, someone who just couldn't get over how sick he was feeling, who didn't really feel anything apart from like terrible gastric kind of distress, as he says. And he says, he ended up saying, I'll have to take these visions on trust, I'm not going to try that again. Whereas his contemporary and friend Weir Mitchell, the neurologist, had just produces this beautiful kind of purple description of sort of visions that roll on for hours and feels as if he's been in fairyland. So I think from early on there are these, the expectations of mescaline are quite mixed. Some people, say, this is a beautiful, entrancing experience, and other people say, this is, this is really horrible. I'm never going to do that to myself again. and I think in terms of this kind of, science is really the framework for this kind of reportage. So people are trying to, it's a subjective experience, but they're trying to present it as objectively as possible, which is a fascinating tension. Right. And they're also, as you say, they're doing the opposite of the Native American experience, so that they're trying to isolate the effects of the drug and take it out from everything else. So these early scientists sitting there with their notepads, are trying to get, correlate dosage and timings and onsets, and also they're just specifically looking for the things that the mescaline is doing. And that's enormously effective in terms of science. The fact that, all these early experiences and subsequently experiences concentrate on the visual effects. That was how mescaline was isolated within a very few years of the first Westerners taking peyote and getting particularly interested in these kind of kaleidoscopic visual hallucinations. Then you end up with chemists kind of breaking the cactus down and fractioning out different samples and trying different ones and seeing which one gives you the hallucinations. And bam, that's the isolation of mescaline almost immediately. So, so that extrapolation, that taking the psychoactivity out of its context, that's really what works for Western science.
And what's interesting too is once you take it out of the context, then it kind of becomes a legal issue, because if you're not doing it in these sort of culturally structured ceremonies where everyone kind of knows the rules of what you're supposed to do, you isolate a drug and there is no rule. And like you said, it interacts differently with each person. Does that change how sort of Western law perceives these psychedelic drugs?
I think quite often it doesn't, because if you think of you think of sort of datura or jimson weed, which grows everywhere wild. We have those fly agaric mushrooms. There are quite a lot of these kind of natural plant intoxicants which are uncontrolled by law because they're just kind of toxic and unpleasant, and not that many people take them. I think the problem really is when they become, desirable culturally, and when they become a, commodity economically. So what's interesting is that mescaline, for really right up until the 60s or 70s, was perfectly legal. So most of, and it was supplied as a tincture by the, Park Davis, the pharmaceutical company. It was really, this is a long period where the only people, sort of Westerners, who were really interested in it were a handful of kind of bizarre and interesting avant-garde artists, and but apart from that, anthropologists and psychologists and psychiatrists. And in that situation, it kind of seemed to survive without controls for a very long time until the 60s and the beginning of a psychedelic counterculture. And that was really when the legal force kicked in for Westerners. All through that time, however, the Native American tribes, and then later the Native American Church, who incorporated for their legal protection, they were being legally harassed all the way through from the late 19th century through to the 1990s. There were many attempts at federal prohibition of peyote, and many attempts to keep it off the reservations and so on.
It's interesting, too, because another group who was kind of harassed by federal law, who went out west to start new things, was the Mormon Church.
Mm-hmm.
And even they had a new interaction, obviously, because they were interacting with native groups, native peoples, and they were on the Mexican border and in Mexico. Can you talk a little bit about that for people who might not know?
Yeah, I mean, for the Mormon Church, their outreach and their missionary activities among Indian tribes was very important to them. And there was a president of the Reformed Church, Frederick Smith, in the 1910s, who was the grandson of Joseph Smith, who was very interested in this, participated in peyote ceremonies, did a doctorate in psychology, studying the effects of ecstatic experiences and trance states, and writing a kind of history of this in religions and cultures around the world. And he became quite persuaded that this was what his Mormon Church needed. That this was a time, sort of beginning of the 20th century, when life was becoming dull and routinized and mechanized, and he really felt that it was very important for religious traditions to provide some kind of genuine ecstatic experience, and he advocated the use of peyote as a sacrament within the Mormon context.
Yeah, and we see this sort of this constant connection to spiritual sort of looking outside, I guess, regardless of Western or non-Western context. One of the reasons, and I think it's visible from the cover of the book and certainly the artwork, it is this connection to art and connection to colors that is sort of spurred by mescaline. What is it that does that? Why is this such a powerful artistic experience?
I think it's definitely kind of one of the major effects that you notice of a kind of decent dose of mescaline in any form, is that things become very brightly colored, and colors take on kind of particular sort of depth and significance, and loads of people have described this. And again, very early on in the 1890s, one of the earliest people to take peyote, the first in Britain, in fact, was Havelock Ellis, who was a doctor. We remember him now for his studies of the psychology of sex. But he was also an aesthete and literary critic. And he and his coterie were fascinated by the effects of mescaline on listening to music or looking at art and painting. That's within a sort of context of, I guess, sort of the symbolist movement. But by the time you get to the 1920s, when mescaline is quite widely available as a research chemical from pharmaceutical suppliers, you're into the sort of era of modernism, where you've got a whole generation of modernist artists who are fascinated by the idea of deconstructing the way the world looks and changing the frame and disturbing all our kind of our normal consensual perceptions. And then you get a lot of artists who are interested in taking mescaline and drawing and painting on it. And you also have a lot of scientists who are trying to investigate its effects, which they tend to regard as hallucinations. So not in a spiritual context so much as in a sort of cognitive psychological context. But they're trying to capture these hallucinations and the way they work. So you get a lot of collaborations between psychologists and artists at this point, where a psychologist will sit down with an artist, inject them with some mescaline, and then give them some Rorschach tests to look at, and maybe give them a few other sort of prompts, play them music, or give them a perfume to smell, and get them to paint or draw their responses to all these stimuli. So you get this wonderful kind of cross-fertilization of art and science at that point.
And in your reading of this history of mescaline, do you find this collaboration between art and science? I mean, you kind of just said wonderful, but do you find it like sort of as a fruitful door to not just alternative perceptions? Is there more to this, or is it just that people are seeing the world in a different way?
I think seeing the world in a different way can be something that's kind of trivial, just like peering down a kind of child's kaleidoscope, or it can be something very profound. And I think it's a short step from seeing the world presented completely differently to feeling that to reconceiving your broader ideas of meaning. And I think there are, in a way, sort of two different traditions of mescaline that run through the 20th century. And one is kind of, being fascinated by this sort of derangement of the senses that it presents and trying to capture it and using that as a spur for art or literature. And the other is, taking this experience as being something that's more spiritual, that puts you into a state where you're connected to the wider world, including the invisible world or the spirit world, in a way that you normally aren't.
And this is not, as you can tell by the book, I mean, it goes to present day, it goes to, 2017. And this is something that's still around and something that still exists. Maybe you could introduce a little bit of the Native American church and some of the struggles they've actually had in the United States to people who might not know.
Yeah, well, I found it absolutely fascinating, and I spent some time in Oklahoma, and I learnt a lot from people about their traditions and their histories, and I was very generously invited to partake in their ceremonies. And it was kind of, to me, it's sort of in terms of the history, this is kind of central, because this is really the indigenous world meets the modern West moment, and you can actually capture that moment quite precisely. I think there's a ethnologist from the Smithsonian Institution called James Mooney, who was the first white person to participate in a Native American peyote meeting, and he was one of the great advocates of it. Very much swimming against the tide at that point. This was a time when the Federal Indian Bureau was all about assimilation. It was all about kind of sending Indian kids off to boarding schools where they, learn Christianity and forget their native tongues. So the small handful of ethnographers like James Mooney were, scrabbling to preserve centuries, millennia of culture before they disappeared. And Mooney kind of really fixed on the peyote ceremony as saying, this is what's going to keep, Indian culture together. This is a way in which it can coexist kind of, within the new white culture that has to survive within. And he was the person who, there was a, He was trying to. He spent a lot of time in Oklahoma with groups like the Kiowa and the Comanches, who were sort of among the first people to develop the peyote ceremony, and he was the one who sort of brought peyote back to the West, back to Washington D.C., and passed it on to the medics and scientists at the universities there and in the Federal Department of Agriculture. So there's a moment right there where, the sort of millennia of indigenous culture give way to, a moment of transmission across to Western modernity. So I spent quite a lot of time in the book looking at that because I think it's a fascinating moment. And then I think what's fascinating from that is the two subsequent histories of mescaline. Within European culture, it became a kind of curiosity and then kind of a sensation and launched the 60s counterculture, and then, was subsumed by all these other drugs like LSD that came later. Whereas within the Native American church, the peyote ceremony is still very much as it was, and, it's still, a kind of focus for the culture, and, as the federal policy moved from assimilation to cultural pluralism, it was something that's really, kind of, I think, not just preserved, but also shaped and defined Native American culture over the last century.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point that there's this, especially in academia, this kind of unnecessary, this tension between ethnologists and anthropologists and historians. And one thing that historians constantly rely on are these people like James Mooney, who went out and, did this in the early days. So I think it's kind of wonderful to see you mix so many disciplines in this study. And you certainly... Yeah.
I think James Mooney was very, even among ethnologists at that point, and among the, sympathetic, sort of progressive kind of white Western people who were getting interested in Native American culture at that point. Most of them regarded peyote, because the peyote meeting had only reached them on the reservations. Most of them regarded it as a kind of late sort of rather degenerate, rather sad thing, like the sort of heavy alcohol drinking. So most of Mooney's colleagues were not interested in the peyote ceremonies. This is just something that's kind of popped up on the reservation. It didn't have kind of, the sort of seal of antiquity behind it, So even within the ethnologists, he's, then it's hard for the historian, to locate people apart from James Mooney who are really documenting this at the time.
And it's interesting to see that interaction where at different times in different places, ethnologists, historians, news reporters, all these people play such an important role in kind of shaping how something is viewed by the greater public. And your book is truly a global history. It does take us from South America to Oklahoma, London, Vienna, Saskatchewan. We're going all over the world with this. And perceptions do change. Can you maybe peer beyond the scope of your book into the future? Do you think perceptions will continue to change with works like yours coming out?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating history. I have to say, I think it's kind of a gift for historians because it's full of all these fascinating stories, particularly if you're interested in the way in which science and medicine interact with culture, and if you're interested in cross-cultural exchange. And there's stories that haven't really been looked at very much. The history of drugs is now, there's a younger generation of academics are now taking it much more seriously than it was taken before. I mean, previous generations of, drug history was taken to be mostly kind of either sort of public health or criminology. Mm-hmm. People weren't so interested in the experience and the culture around it. I think that's changing. And I think so. Yeah, I think in terms of the historiography, we're starting to see a lot more, and there are loads of great stories out there. And in terms of the way that these sort of psychedelics, for example, sit within Western culture, I think that's changing. I think it's getting harder now it's very clear in the 60s that there was a counterculture who were interested in this stuff, who were kind of very small and were very passionate about it, opposed to quite a monolithic, sort of cultural and political and legal consensus that this was, sort of not part of our culture. I think those lines are a lot more blurred now. So I think looking forward, we're going to see something much more syncretic, where the role of psychedelics in sort of Western and non-Western cultures is going to become, much more of a spectrum, much more blended and gradated.
Yeah, it is very interesting, and it'll be interesting to see where that sort of goes. Certainly, I mean, this book, there's been a reception for it. Can you talk a little bit about how people have received it so far?
Yeah, I ended up with this very simple title for it, Mescaline, because whenever I said to people I was writing a book about mescaline, everybody went, "Oh, wow, great, cool," and I could never quite work out what they're talking about. Are people thinking like Hunter S. Thompson, or are they thinking Aldous Huxley? But I think what it is it's kind of in the moment we are now, where of that sort of psychedelic renaissance, as it's being called. Mescaline has this kind of legendary status because everybody's heard about it. But nobody's kind of taken it. It's not really around as a drug anymore. It's just been, so many other things have evolved that, kind of cherry pick the more pleasant effects. It's just kind of been designed out by our kind of restless sort of Western culture. But I think the psychedelic renaissance is kind of predicated on a couple of ideas that this book sort of challenges or disturbs. It's kind of predicated on the idea that psychedelics suddenly arrived in the 1950s or the 1960s, and then they were almost immediately suppressed. And now, for the first time, we're starting to kind of grasp how, how they might be used in, psychotherapy or, neuroscience or whatever else. And I think, it's a good moment for a book like this because there's a general interest in psychedelics. But I think picking Mescaline's story gives you a rather different frame for it. It's like, actually, this was all being explored for decades before the 60s, and also, ideas of how psychedelics might be used for healing and therapy go back, not just decades, but, centuries and millennia. So I hope it's kind of putting a broader, more panoramic frame about, around this thing that's of immediate cultural interest at the moment.
Absolutely. And one of the things that sort of gives you this, in a lot of ways, it opened the doors for you to write such an expansive book, is your kind of prolific career as an author. You've written on a ton of different subjects, a ton of different things, in all genres. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how many topics you've done and what that kind of contributed to where you are now, or just even talk about your path a little bit?
Yeah, well, my path is not out of academia. I did a degree in philosophy at Cambridge University. I kind of left that kind of really not wanting to read another book again in my life. And so I kind of diverted for the first sort of decade of my career. I sort of worked in film and television. I became much more interested in sort of visual language, and I got back into writing through journalism and through screenplays. So I think probably I write unusually for a historian. I sort of slightly have, I think, a sort of mental idea of a book should be kind of like a good movie, So I think it's probably, my books are probably a bit more of the kind of, for better or worse, they're a bit more, that's like sort of in the template of the movie rather than the template of the lecture series, that a lot of academic history is. And I then kind of, I started writing about drugs as a topic quite early on in sort of journalism. This kind of around the beginnings, I was an early adopter of the internet. So early 90s, I started writing about, drug culture on the net and that kind of thing. And nobody else much was doing it then. So it became kind of a niche. I moved on and did a lot of other things. I've written a lot more generally around the history of science, and and also I've been I've been kind of a writer for hire, a journalist or whatever. So and then drugs was just a topic that people kept. It's kind of perennially sexy subject. People kind of kept commissioning more stuff off it. So it became my specialism, but it's a great specialism because it's not really a specialism. It's a sort of generalism. It's an excuse to just range across everything from neuroscience to anthropology to art to literature to history. So it continues to be sort of really rewarding to work in and full of great stories.
And where does someone go after writing such a seminal global history?
Well, the answer sort of for me in the short term is kind of, back into, I write quite a lot for, journals like the New York Review of Books and the Wall Street Journal. I've got a sort of portfolio as a freelance writer, and I kind of go back into that, and then I sort of slowly start, I like to have, I'm lucky enough to have sort of the chance, and actually the internet is quite good these days for being able to write kind of decent, sort of 2, 3, 4,000 word essay pieces. That's kind of quite an easy thing to sell these days. And so I guess I do a few of those, and then out of those, the next big topic will coalesce, I hope.
Well, thank you. We really appreciate it. Now we're unfortunately drawing close to the end of the hour here, but fortunately getting to that point where you can kind of offer some wisdom and point the Hour of History listeners into the direction of a suggestion. If you could suggest anything for the listeners of this podcast, what would you like to suggest?
Oh, I just simply because I just read it and really, really thoroughly enjoyed it. I would recommend a historical novel, which is called The Moor's Account, which is about probably the most extraordinary early cultural encounter between the Spanish and the Native American Indians. You may know is the sort of that of Cabeza de Vaca, who was an early Spanish explorer who arrived in Florida and got shipwrecked and separated from his party and spent years wandering across what we now know to be Mississippi and Texas, and eventually ran into his compadres down in Mexico. He wrote a sort of very celebrated travel journal of this, and it's a fascinating book. And he ended up traveling with a party of 4, of which one of them he only mentions in one line, was a black slave, from the coast of North Africa. And The Moor's Account is a novel by an American, Arab-American novelist called Leila Lalami. And she has written Cabeza de Vaca's journey from the perspective of the black slave. So it's somebody who starts life in Morocco, Algeria, in West Africa, ends up being captured, becomes a slave in Spain, goes to the New World, and then meets an entire new set of people. So it's kind of, it's a fascinating investigation of the other and encounters with the other in that age of discovery, but also particularly a meditation on slavery. It's what it's like to be a slave in a Spanish culture, and then to find yourself, in a Native American culture where you become, effectively the slaves of whatever tribe will adopt you, and just the exchanges of power and culture that run through it. It's beautifully written. It's kind of got that sort of tough, kind of quite hard-bitten prose, sort of like, was like a spaghetti western in places, but also a sort of rather fantastical, more sort of Arabian Nights kind of language to it. It's a beautifully written story, and I just found it a fascinating exploration of, as you say, the global history that we're all now so interested in.
Yeah, that sounds like an absolutely great suggestion. I have no idea how to follow that up. You really sold it. I mean, it's it's funny too, and we've talked about this on Hour of History. I've had some guests before, and that sort of slavery under the Spanish and involving natives and just that mix of cultures there's a lot of historians who are coming up to do research on that, and it's just a fascinating area to sort of watch out for. Wow, that kind of changes my suggestion a little bit.
I'm sorry. No, I want yours.
No, because I've read mine is I'm so late to the game on some of these things. I do have a lot to read. I mean, I do have, like you said, when you study things like philosophy or history, you're just reading all the time. No, and I came very late to this. I'm not a fan of true crime at all normally, but it was suggested to me that I should read All Be Gone in the Dark, which is Michelle McNamara, her search for the Golden State Killer. And
right.
Normally I absolutely hate these kind of things, especially because it's just so real and not my wheelhouse. I like to do like the global histories and go way back in the past. And but I had to read this mostly because it took place where I grew up in California, and it's just it's fascinating to me. It's horrifying, first of all, but it's fascinating to me what people can do when they really apply themselves in research. And I think that was the appealing thing. And you can see this in any good book. Obviously, you can see it in Your Global History is when you really follow the threads of whether it is a murderer or a drug or a scientist or an artist or anything. It is very rewarding to kind of read these intellectual journeys. So
great. Well, that's two great sounding novels for summer reading.
In addition to yours, which we will have the link to on hourofhistory.com. Anything else you want to add before we sign off?
No, that was a real pleasure talking to you, Stephen.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to have you. Mike J. The book is called Mescaline, A Global History of the First Psychedelic, and it's fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us on Hour of History. It's our world, anytime, any place. So long.
Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out our recommendations page at hourofhistory.com/recs. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. There you'll find links to the books mentioned during the podcast, and if you choose to purchase one, you'll be supporting the podcast in the process. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, make sure you head over to the Hour of History blog, found at hourofhistory.com/blog, with articles being released fairly often on topics relating to those covered in the podcast as well as others. With that, we conclude this episode and hope to have you back for the next one. Take care, and again, thanks for listening to the Hour of History podcast.